Welcome to Autoptic 2021, a conversation with Joshua Cotter. I'm Sean Knickerbocker, and we're here with our guest, Josh. Josh, can you tell us a little bit about your new book, Not Away, Volume 2?
I'm not good at the quick sell, but it's just it's a continuation of the story. It's not away altogether. It's going to be 7 volumes, and
Mhm,
it's an overall story that's going to be told from seven different protagonists. Um, it's uh
mhm.
it's not hard sci-fi. I guess sci-fi would be the best way to describe it, but it's not that I adhere to any of the genre tropes or anything. More than anything, I use the genre um, as a way of just progressing the story I want to tell. There was a story I wanted to tell when I first started writing, and it felt that using science fiction aspects of science fiction were the best way to tell it. But as far as the new story goes, it'd be hard to it'd be hard to explain
Yeah,
everything about the book without going through the entirety of volume one too.
and so Volume 1 came out in 2018. New volume's coming out in September, right?
2016 was the first volume. Yeah, so I worked on volume two for 6 years. It's 300 almost 370 pages, and it takes me about 16 hours a page, not counting writing or anything else. So it's taken me a long time to finish this volume. It'll be the longest volume in the series. It's it's essentially three stories in one. So I had
Mhm.
to. There's a lot of information I had to get down in this volume, and I knew it was going to be long from the get go. I didn't know it was going to be almost 400 pages, but it is what it is, and it's a fairly. I have it sitting right here. It's a fairly thick book. It's so it feels good to have a thick book, and 6 years of work. I'm happy with how it turned out, but
Yeah.
future volumes will be far slimmer.
Yeah, well, it's still a really impressive pace, all things considered. I mean, like you said, your drawings are incredibly dense. It doesn't surprise me that it takes you that long to draw them. Uh,
And yeah, it's I don't mind taking that long. It's it's I draw the page. Each page I draw, I want it to, I get to the point where I'm satisfied with it. Yeah, I mean, 6 years isn't an unreasonable amount of time for the amount of work that went into it. And
Definitely.
if I had to work a regular job like I used to, which I've kind of organized my life where I can live somewhat modestly and just put all my efforts into my own work. Like I was telling you earlier before we started recording, we moved here from Chicago because it is more affordable. I don't have to work a full time job. I can just do freelance on the side to keep things going. So I have a lot more time to focus on drawing that way. But it's I'm in my mid 40s now, so it's taken a long time to get to this point.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just over time I had to reprioritize and figure out what my priorities were. There was a period 12, 10, 12 years ago that I didn't know if I could make comics anymore because I didn't have energy for a full time job and making comics. So I had to reorganize quite a bit and figure out if I want to keep making comics.
Mm-hmm.
I worked in a factory, and that was the moment where I realized like I can't do this. I have to do creative work, and I have to find a way to make it work. And so I've been very fortunate to, because not everybody's so fortunate.
Sure.
I worked my life to a point where I can if I'm not with my family, I'm drawing, and it's I'm happy.
That's awesome. So going back a little bit to your first book, which came out from Ad House, well, your first like graphic novel book, right? Like Skyscrapers in the Midwest, and that was originally mini comics, correct?
I started out self-publishing mini comics. I think before that, I did a self-published series called Fun, and I did that 2001, 2002. And so it's been, I guess I've been making comics for 20 years now.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how that happened. But and then after that, I wanted to do like a one-man anthology type thing, and I that's when I created Skyscrapers. I had a few childhood stories I wanted to tell.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know. I thought maybe I'd make an issue or two. I didn't know it would turn into a hardbound collection someday. But yeah, I started out 2003, I think, making
Mm-hmm.
Skyscrapers, and then did a couple mini comics, and then Ad House picked it up and made 4 floppies, and then the floppies were collected in the hardcover collection in 2008.
Mhm. And the style of that book, like it's very much kind of like that funny animal kind of like underground comics kind of vibe. Was that kind of an influence?
I don't have as much underground influence as some people. I didn't have access to that growing up. Uh, I didn't have the cool cousin or cool older brother that read underground comics, and I would be able to sneak into his room and read them. I was aware of it in college.
Mhm.
Growing up in the rural area, I didn't have access to hardly anything at all besides Mad Magazine.
Yeah.
So if anything, Mad was probably more an influence on me. But as far as the funny animal thing, I believe I did it in an effort because it's pretty personal material
Mhm.
and it's pretty emotional material. And if I drew the characters as human, I don't think the story would have came across the same way. It would have been a little bit too intense. So if anything, and uh, and to make the characters anthropomorphic, I think it allows the audience to come into the story a bit more. So if anything, it's creating more of a buffer zone, but it's also creating characters that allow the reader to connect to the material.
Mhm.
I couldn't really articulate it at the time, but as I get older and think about it, a lot of the stuff I do is intuitive, and at the time, just made sense to do animals,
Mhm.
cats, and being able to better articulate it now, it was an effort to soften the blow a little bit
Yeah.
and make and because childhood themes are fairly universal, and although rural Midwestern themes are a little bit different, I still wanted audiences. I didn't want to limit audiences to seeing it as just a very specific experience. I wanted that childhood experience, and then with childhood, a lot of childhood entertainment involves animals, so it made sense to go that route
Mhm.
to me.
Yeah. And with skyscrapers and even with Not Away, the like the environments that you're drawing a lot of tend to be like those kind of like rural Midwestern environments.
Hmm.
So I suppose that landscape probably kind of like built into your work a little bit. It seems.
I believe environment's a very important part of storytelling.
Hmm.
I consider environment to be a character, and the environment is something I'm very familiar with. And as many problems as I have with Missouri in the Midwest,
Yeah.
on a social level, there's some very beautiful areas,
Hmm.
and they're rarely represented in comics. Not, I mean, they are, but not as much as say like stories that take place in crowded urban areas. So since I have the experience growing up and it's the landscape I know, it's the character. If I consider environment to be a character, it's the character I'm most familiar with. I think it's what I can bring to the table as far as a writer goes.
Hmm. And you had mentioned a little bit earlier about kind of like balancing when you were working like kind of like a full time job, but balancing between cartooning and a full time job in factory and freelance work. Was this kind of around the time that you were working on Driven by Lemons, or like was that kind of like triggered by that whole experience?
Driven by Lemons was when I hit a wall. Before that, I graduated from college in 1999. I studied illustration. It was one of those things where I was expected to go to college, so I chose something I was interested in, drawing, and in an effort to make it practical, because art, as far as practicality goes, if you're trying to make a living, it's not exactly that. But I thought through illustration I could.
Mm-hmm.
But I illustration. I did some freelance when early on, and but I had to have a regular job too, just starting out from college. So I did graphic design, like not even graphic design, it was production design,
Mm-hmm.
designing bumper stickers, political posters, stuff like that. And I had to work a full time job, working 40, anywhere from 40 60 hours a week. And then comics started. I started developing an interest in making my own comics about 20 years ago. So I was working a full time job, making mini comics, and doing a weekly strip for the Kansas City Star.
Mm-hmm.
So I was working anywhere from 80 to 100 hours a week, and there wasn't much time left over. But fortunately, for anything else, relationships or anything. But in my 20s, I had the energy to do it. But by the time I moved to Chicago, I was nearing my 30s, and as you get older, as many people know, you just have less energy. And I after Skyscrapers, after just finishing it all, by that point I had worked on it for about 5 years, and I describe it as postpartum depression, but I'm a massive I'm a major depressive anyway. I'm a massive depressive, but I'm also a major depressive, and
Mhm.
I find that art is or drawing is my way of keeping that under control. But after Skyscrapers, I it's not that I didn't have any ideas, but I'd just been pushing so hard for so many years, and it just like I went off. It felt like I went off a cliff,
Mhm.
and uh, and just being suspended in air, and like like a Elmer Fudd, like when he walks off and he's about to fall, and I realize I'm about to fall, and I started falling, and I didn't know what to do about it, and the depression became unmanageable, and before I hit rock bottom, I started drawing in a sketchbook. I just grabbed a sketchbook and started digging into it, and it became Driven by Lemons, and it really saved me. It helped get my head back straight and gave me some direction. And even though after Lemons it was another 3 years, I guess Lemons came out in 2009, and it was another 3 years after that before I was really able to start working on again and get to the point where like, okay, am I going to have to work in factories and what et cetera the rest of my life, or am I going to try to make comics work? And I finally got to the point where I could figure out how to make comics work. But it's difficult, and anybody that does comics cartooning knows. I mean, it's just we live in a society that's all wrapped up in money, and I would like to be out of that kind of system, but that's a little too ideal for this stage in the game. So realistically, you have to have something to pay for food and shelter, and just through freelance job here and there, and finding a balance. Really, I think that's the key, is finding a balance in life. But it just takes experience. It's a lot of hit and miss and figuring things out. And at this point in my life, I've come to a point where I have enough freelance to allow for me to continue making comics.
Mhm.
And I mean, who knows what tomorrow will bring? But right now, it's working.
Yeah. You had mentioned that you were doing a early on. You were doing a comic strip for the Kansas City Star. You said.
Yeah, I did a weekly strip. It was initially called Send Help, but it was a dream for me. I was a couple years out of college, and I grew up growing up in the middle of nowhere. Besides Mad Magazine and the little spinner rack that was at the grocery store that had superhero comics, and I had very little access to comics besides the Sunday paper. And we around here, you subscribe to the Sunday paper there, because that's the day when they come around and actually deliver. And
Mhm.
the first thing I went for was the Sunday funnies, and to have well, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but when I started making mini comics, my first mini comic fun came out. It got the attention of someone at the Star,
Mhm.
and I was asked to do a weekly, and it was great. And then actually having the weekly was really good for me, having a deadline once a week and trying to come up with a gag. And a lot of them were terrible. It's just it's me figuring things out as I went along.
Mhm.
But I did that. I did it almost solid for 5 or 6 years. And the things I thought weren't that were passing, as far as like showing them to an audience. Chris and I at House collected them in a book called Barbara in the Skies with Neil Diamonds. Um, and I had kind of a Neil Diamond thing going at the end of my strip.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, I worked on the strip. But at the end, it was getting towards the Driven by Lemons, me having some mental instability issues, and it became
Mhm.
much more experimental and strange. And I was very fortunate to have an editor that stuck by me through it all, and allowed me to do things that weren't common in a widely circulated newspaper. The Kansas City Star, I think it was the third largest newspaper in the country at the time. So
Wow.
I had quite a bit of readership. A lot of people hated the strip, but like I said, I had an editor that was really supportive, and he would just take all the hate mail and deal with it. And it was a even though not a whole lot of people have seen the work, it was a way for me to experiment and grow. I
Sure.
was very fortunate to have that experience.
And that was in a Sunday paper. So were those like full color like Sunday strips, or like were they just like?
When I was a kid. That was actually the strip I made was in a Friday entertainment
Okay.
section
Okay.
of
Cool.
the regular newspaper, so it was full color. So I made full color strips. So initially, it was called Send Help, and it was just kind of like Gary Larson in a way, where every week there were no set characters. I just did what I wanted every week. Um, I pitched like a cat strip, but they figured with Garfield and a couple others there were enough cat strips. I have a thing with cats, I guess. Uh, but I was like, well, okay, well, otherwise, I like the Larson model where you just kind of do whatever you want day to day.
So for Not Away, you've already kind of like mapped this out to being 7 separate books. Like, so
Hmm.
how much like writing has already gone into it? Do you have like everything like cemented down, or is it more just kind of like
One
a vague sense?
one of the it's well, it's one of the I'll try to explain it as concisely as possible because I tend to talk too much about it. But it's I started getting ideas while working on Skyscrapers that just didn't fit within that world, so I would keep things, information, ideas in a sketchbook.
Mhm.
And after I finished Skyscrapers and Lemons, when I was able to write, when I started getting back into functional adult mode, I started collecting the ideas and seeing what was there, and taking puzzle pieces and putting them next to each other, and seeing what I could do with it. And I'd say around after Lemons came out in 2009, and after that, I was kind of somewhat back on track. And for about a year, I started collecting ideas, and by the end of a year, I had a pretty good idea that I had 7 protagonists. That through these different protagonists, I could tell an entire story. And I had never, at that time, I didn't know it was going to be almost 2,000 pages by the time I was done, but I thought maybe 7 100-page books or something.
Mhm.
It's as things go with me, it kind of ballooned into something much more. But I had an idea. I knew the 7 characters at that point, and I knew the general outline of the story. It wasn't like I had everything detailed nailed down because I think it's important as an author to have flexibility.
Mhm.
But if you think of it as like connect the dots, I had the dots down, and I needed to connect those dots. And by connecting the dots, telling the story, and then by connecting those, there was flexibility in how I told the story as long as I got from one point to the next.
Mhm.
Uh, but at the end of 2010, right when I was getting to the point where I was going to start doing some serious writing besides just gathering notes and actually writing out the story, we had an apartment fire in Chicago. Momoko, my wife, and I, she was my girlfriend at the time, partner, and it just threw our lives kind of into chaos for about a year. And at the end of the year, well, we were thinking about leaving Chicago anyway. She's from Kobe, Japan, and we were considering moving to Kyoto, but we weren't married yet, so I couldn't get the visa. So we were kind of in a position where we had to make a decision what we were going to do. So that's when we. She's a ceramicist, and she wanted her own studio space,
Mhm.
and it would be more affordable to do it since my parents have the farmland here. We could pretty affordably build a house on our own,
Mhm.
um, and build a studio and just kind of hole up and make art and have a couple kids, and that's what we decided to do. But by the time we built the house and got moved in, uh, and then we had a my son was born right as soon as, like, a week after we finished building the house, my son was born.
Mhm.
So once the dust settled, almost 3 years had passed since Driven by Lemons,
Mhm.
and during that time, I wasn't writing a whole lot because just I need routine, I need stability in order to really to be allowed to create, and it took a few years to get to that point where I had that stability. But once my son was born and got past the stage of infancy, um, that's when I pulled the sketchbooks back out, and I'm glad I had that period because looking at the stuff I wrote in 2009, there were quite a few things that changed, but the thing that didn't change was I had 7 protagonists and 7 books, and I started writing pretty seriously again. Within a few months, I was working on volume 1 of Not Away.
I guess for me, I mean, like maybe it's a really obvious comparison. Like, forgive me if like it's like been territory you've covered a lot of times. We can just skip over it. But I was curious if Philip K. Dick had like any influence on in terms of like you're writing the sci-fi, because it feels
Uh,
very much like a Philip K. Dick style of sci-fi story where it's like psychological.
I've only read 2 or 3 Philip Dick books, and
Mhm.
I really should read more. And as much as I like Philip K. Dick, I think he's more of a concept guy than a writer because he was so amped up on amphetamines and
Mhm.
just kind of hacking's not the right word because he was brilliant, but the writing doesn't appeal to me as much as his ideas do. So
Sure.
sure, his ideas, yeah, they appeal to me. But I think there's that humans against establishment ideas
Mhm.
that are in Dick's work, but that are also in a lot of my other influences. I would say Vonnegut is more of a influence on me
Sure.
than Dick is. But Dick's approach to science fiction, I absolutely respect, and I don't know. you hate criticizing a person like that because it's probably going to bring people down on me. But I
Yeah.
just, like I said, his writing doesn't appeal to me as much as his
The
ideas.
concepts, sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, Vonnegut feels apt too. Do you feel like you have a strong appreciation for science fiction, or like you said, you mentioned this was mostly just a tool to tell this story, but I was just wondering if you had like a
I do. But I'm also not like into high sci-fi. I
yeah,
growing up here. Another thing was I didn't have a library around. I didn't have access to much at all.
yeah,
What I did have access to were VHS tapes, and so sci-fi film probably had a greater influence on me than anything. Uh, Ridley Scott's Alien. Like these. They're technically sci-fi. They work within sci-fi, but they're more than that. They're genre bending. And things like Stanley Kubrick's 2001, where it's sci-fi, but it's telling a human story. Uh, Growing up, finally, when I got older and got out of rural Missouri and had access to more, then I started reading more sci-fi. I imagine a hard sci-fi fan would take issue with me working in sci-fi, but it just is what it is. I love the genre, and I try to read as much of it as I can these days. But in my formative years, I didn't have as much access to it.
again with going, talking a little bit more about Nottoway, like I feel like there's a pretty solid connection between like the story you're telling and like perhaps some sort of commentary on the development of the internet or like what the internet is doing to people in general.
It's commentary, sure. The most frustrating thing is about it is we have access to almost the entirety of the knowledge of mankind to this date, and we still don't use it. We use it to, white supremacists use it to organize, and
Mm,
people use it to yell at each other. But we have access to almost nearly unlimited information, and it's not being utilized. And I think it's just because um, the human race, humanity, is still in very much a juvenile stage of development.
mm,
um, and while something like the internet can be used for such good, it's not.
yeah.
And it's I guess it's a commentary on that, where something with such great potential goes to waste. And it's very frustrating because we're at a point in civilization where if we were mature enough, we could accomplish incredible things.
Mhm,
But for whatever reason, people tend to just veer towards selfishness and the need to oppress others to preserve self. And
mhm,
so those are concerns of mine, and I'm sure concerns of many others. And it's my way of writing. My purpose in writing is to try to figure that out. But I think in the end of Not Away, people are going to understand that the story isn't entirely about the internet. The internet is just a means to an end, really. The sci-fi concepts are a means in telling the story, but by using those means, I'm also able to explore modern concepts, which is what a lot of sci-fi is using futuristic ideas, concepts, potential, science realities to explore and understand the world you live in.
mhm. So you had mentioned that you're also doing a little bit of
I do freelance reading.
freelance reading.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I HBO approached me a few years ago when the first Nottoway came out, and they worked on developing it for a while, and
Mm,
it just didn't work out, and
mhm.
it wasn't the most pleasant experience, but I liked working with HBO, and there were a few people there I made connections with,
Yeah.
and I told them I was like, well, I don't exactly make LA money here, and I would like to at least be able to survive continue making comics. If you ever have any work, let me know.
Mhm,
And they reached out a couple years ago, and they have production companies present them with books
mhm,
to be considered for adaptation. And basically, I'm myself and a few other people are we read them, write book reports for executives,
mhm,
and suggest whether it'd be worth looking at or not. So rather than them reading a 400-page book, we do it, and then we try to sum it up in 5 or 6 pages.
mhm.
So I right now most of my freelance work is reading, which is pretty great.
Yeah.
I never even knew you could get paid to read, but I mean it's a great job to have, especially living here in the middle of nowhere. And it gives me the opportunity to read things I never would have otherwise,
Mhm.
like popular things that you may pick up at an airport or something. The kind of stuff I personally skip over, and even if a lot of it is not to my taste, I can still learn from it. I can learn as a writer, as an author,
Hmm.
of what works for me and what doesn't work for me. So it's been a very good experience.
Yeah, it seems like that has a really nice built-in balance to it in terms of like also being a cartoonist. You don't have to worry about like expending all of your drawing energy on freelance
Very
stuff.
much,
Yeah.
yeah. Because the freelance one of the problems with freelance illustration is if I was drawing constantly, which as much as I love drawing, if you're doing it all the time, it becomes work. So when I draw so much on with comics, I can also step back and just read, and it creates a healthier balance.
So for volume three, even though we're volume two is just coming out, uh, how are you just in the early phases of that, or are you
I'm
like,
in the early
yeah,
phases. After I finished Not Away 2, I finished it. It's kind of always kind of vague because you always have little things to do,
mm-hmm,
but I finished it back February, March. I took a couple months where I didn't do much art related
sure,
because this, especially there towards the end, when you're finishing a book with production, there's a lot of pushing and lots of edits and
mm-hmm,
working over time to meet a deadline, and I was fairly exhausted by the end.
mm-hmm,
I took a couple months off, but yeah, recently early this summer I started gathering my notes and what I had written for volume three, and I'm starting to form it into the story. And I don't write a script. I've never been a script writer, but
mm-hmm,
I do kind of write a story out first,
mm-hmm.
and then I revise it two or three times. Not so much that I overwork it, but just refining.
Yeah,
And I get to the point of like what needs to be in the story in order for it to work for me. And it's the editing process. And once that's down, then I start breaking it down into pages. So most likely by the end of the year, I'll be drawing.
right. And for larger projects like these, like, how do you, I mean, how do you schedule that out? You know.
The good thing with Fantagraphics is, or independent publishers in general, is they're very flexible.
Mm-hmm,
And when I start a book like Not Away Volume Two, which is 370 pages, I have no idea
mm-hmm,
how long it's going to take me.
yeah,
So for the first 3 or 4 years, I'm just working, and
mm-hmm,
at the Eric Reynolds with Fanta is like, okay, you just do your thing, and when you get closer to getting a better idea of how this is taking shape, let me know. So
mm-hmm,
after working on it for 3 or 4 years, I start talking to him. I was like, okay, by that point, I have a pretty good idea of my pace, and
yeah,
unforeseen disaster. Without taking those into consideration, which
mm-hmm,
last year was unforeseen disaster after forcing unforeseen disaster. But I have an idea of, despite those things, when I'm going to complete it, and then they can start scheduling for publishing. So it's just basically by maintaining communication between Eric and me.
do you have like a daily, like regimen in terms of like this is the amount of work, like I'm going to try and spend X amount of hours working on this, or is it kind of just like when it comes to you, you just kind of work
No,
on
I
it
can't
a bit
force
more?
myself to. I can't force myself to say, okay, I have to get this much done in a day because I have no idea how much time one page is going to take to another.
Sure.
I know on average it takes me about 16 hours per page,
Hmm.
counting pencils and inks.
Yeah.
Um, that's just average. Some pages are simpler; they take me 10 hours. Some pages are more complex; they could take me 22, 24 hours.
Yeah.
Uh, but my wife and I, since we work at home, we have two children. We share. We look at the week ahead, like every Sunday, and like, okay, we have 5 days. How are we going to split this up?
Yeah.
And we try to split it up evenly. With like during the summer, we can't work as much because the kids are home.
Hmm.
But we just we're pretty flexible with our schedules. But we try to get at least 40 hours in a week,
Yeah.
if more if we can get it. And usually that involves waking up at 4:35 in the morning
Yeah.
to get some extra hours in. But uh, I think having kids has been helpful for me because when I do have my time to work, I get a lot of work done because I know that's all the time I have.
Hmm.
Because otherwise, one thing I learned from Skyscrapers was learning that I need balance. Like while I do need to get the work done, I also need to maintain healthy relationships.
Hmm.
So when I work, I work. When I'm with my family, I'm with my family. But I have the separation. Uh, so, on the days I work, I could work 12 to 14 hours,
Hmm.
and I can almost get a page done in that time.
Yeah.
So that's why it takes 6 years to finish something this big, because it's just the level of detail at which I work.
Mhm.
Um, it's just I know it's going to take me a while to finish a page. I'm not hard on myself if I can't. And some days maybe I'm really on it and I'm feeling really good, and I can ink a couple pages in a day, but it doesn't happen very often.
Mhm. And it seems like over time, your style has definitely gotten more detail oriented. Like the amount of mark making seems, especially in this new
I think
volume,
it's
is
what I
very
always
intense.
well, thank you. I think it's what I always wanted. It's just when I was when I was younger, I just didn't have the chops for it,
Hmm.
and it's something you figure out as you go along. I've always loved detail work, and going back to the stuff I grew up with, like Sunday strips, aren't very complex, but Mad Magazine, you get some pages that were pretty wild, and those just really spoke to me.
Yeah.
And with all the chicken fat and all the details in the background and the environments and it just that type of art always appealed to me, and it comes through in what I do. But when I was starting out with like fun and skyscrapers, I didn't quite know how to accomplish that.
Hmm.
And as I progress, I find it's not necessarily easier, but I have a better understanding of how to get what I'm doing now is more to like what I envisioned and what I wanted to do from the get go, probably.
Hmm.
Just with artists, you have as an artist you have limitations,
Yeah.
and you work through those limitations, or you get those limitations to work for you.
Yeah. Do you have favorite Mad Magazine cartoonists, or like when you were a kid, did you have ones that you went back to that you?
Jack Davis was always my favorite growing
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
I grew up in the '90s, so it wasn't exactly peak Mad,
Yeah.
but I had a lot of collections of the older stuff too. So Jack Davis was probably my favorite, just because he was so good
Yeah.
uh, as an illustrator. Wallace Wood, Will Elder, what little I could see of Basil Wolverton, that stuff really just appealed to me. The highly detailed, lots of intensive hatching.
Hmm.
Uh, I just it gave me sparks in my mind. I just really reacted to it.
Yeah.
And as I got older and had access to more things, I was able to study the other things those guys did. So like
Mm.
EC Comics, I love just poring over the pages and studying the technique, and while yeah, those are 70 years ago, and that style isn't really exactly hot right now.
Yeah.
uh, it's the kind of thing that appeals to me, and I'm gonna, whether it sells or not, I'm gonna draw how I want to draw, and
Sure.
that's how I do it.
It's funny you mentioned that. That really makes sense now looking at your page layouts. They do have like a very like EC Comics kind of grid, like it's very much like that traditional like Kurtzman.
Yeah, Kurtzman's structuring.
Yeah.
I'm sure had a pretty major influence on me.
Hmm. All right. Well, I think we're at a pretty good spot here. Is there any other things you want to cover, Josh? Or
Oh no, I wish I could come. We could do this all in person someday.
yeah,
I hope eventually we get to the point we are able to start doing festivals again.
hopefully.
I miss seeing everyone in the comics community. But it is what it is.
Yeah.
Hope people get vaccinated and wear masks, keep everyone safe, and hopefully get through this sooner than later.
Yes. And where should people go to check out your work?
I don't have a online website really. The only place I post regularly is Instagram. I think it's at Joshua W. Cotter
Hmm.
is my handle, but I wouldn't recommend Facebook to anybody. And I intend to, once I'm done promoting this book, I intend to get off of there permanently. And while I know that, of course, they own Instagram as well, Instagram is my preference because it's more image based and there's not as much trolling going on,
Yeah.
although there is some. But otherwise, I don't have a website or anything. So if
Cool.
you want to see, I usually post progress on Instagram.
Awesome. And the new book comes out September. What's the? I don't.
7th, yeah, the new book comes out September 7th. I have an online store, and then you can get it at Fantagraphics as well. Um, you can get it on Amazon, but I would encourage people to support local bookstores if possible, independent especially.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for your time today, Josh, and we'll see y'all later.